coming. You're about to have an hour of a very, very sleepy discussion on regulation in DeFi. No, if anyone falls asleep, I will be offended. So thanks for coming. I think this is a hot topic, and there's a lot going on. We were just backstage talking, and I think we probably could have spoken about this for hours at this point. So I'm Cathy Yoon. I am going to moderate your discussion. I am Chief Legal Officer at MPCH and General Counsel of our institutional grade MPC crypto wallet called Fraction. And I think, before I let the panelists introduce themselves, regulation in the crypto and DeFi space is just its own animal. I have never in my entire career worked in a space where regulation, rules, and laws kind of permeate every level of any project or company that I work with. I have conversations on regulation with my product team, with my devs, trying to figure out whether or not they're doing something wrong from a back-end perspective. I speak with my chief strategy officer all the time about regulation. And I think it's one of those, it's an area where people are always trying to think regulation first, whether or not they think they should be regulated or whether they shouldn't be. So with that, I just kind of want to set the stage for this panel. We're going to talk about regulation at a high level, but we're hoping to have this be a more useful conversation where you can go and take it away and be able to use it in your operations and how you're thinking of business models or how you're thinking up the platforms and not kind of keeping this at a very high level discussion on regulation in general. So we want you to be able to have actual real takeaways from this. So without further ado, I'm just going to have our panelists introduce themselves.
Hi all, I'm Katherine Kirkpatrick Boss, and I'm General Counsel of Maple. And Maple is basically crypto capital markets. So it facilitates liquidity to crypto natives, and we have a whole bunch of really exciting use cases and growth for facilitating more liquidity in the space. And prior to joining Maple, I was a partner at a large law firm, King & Spalding, where I did government investigations and white collar, including defending a number of SEC or a number of crypto protocols and individuals in SEC enforcement.
I'm Ben DiScipio. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer for Bloom Protocol. We're a decentralized identity platform, certainly intersecting with regulation and topics like KYC are areas that we're involved in. Prior to joining Bloom, I was in investment banking, and we were doing some work with tokenization as well, so I had a previous introduction to DeFi.
Hi, Chris Greico from AVA Labs. We're a decentralized stablecoin. Prior to that, I worked in government for a number of years, both on Capitol Hill, in the White House, and at DOJ, both in Main Justice and at the U.S. Attorney's Office.
And I'm Lee Schneider. I'm the General Counsel at AVA Labs, general nuisance around the blockchain space. Prior to this job, I was General Counsel at Block One, and prior to that, I did all kinds of silly legal things. Not illegal things, legal things.
Okay, so I think before we can even get into the topic of whether or not regulation in DeFi makes sense, can we just talk about decentralization and what we think that means? And I think that's going to just kind of set the stage, and we can kind of go from there. I don't think it's one all-encompassing definition, but I know Lee has thought about what the definition of decentralization is, so I'm going to put you on the spot.
Thank you. I feel like I just got called on by my teacher. So look, I try to think of decentralization in as simple terms as possible. So no single point of failure, no single source of truth, no single authority that's capable of or responsible for changing data. And that's the way I think about it from a blockchain perspective. you can think about it differently from the perspective of DAOs and governance tokens and stuff like that. But I'm not that high level. I'm layer 1. So that's the way I think about it from a layer 1 perspective. And the key to me is the data point, right? If somebody can monkey with the data, then it's probably not decentralized. And we can talk about what that means, but that's sort of the broad strokes of how I think about decentralization.
Okay, so if we're going to work off of that as a definition that we're going to work with, what does that mean? Like from an operational, from a realistic perspective, and like Lee mentioned, there's so many different applications, use cases, so we're not going to be able to have a general blanket way of thinking about it, but I think it would be helpful to just hear from you guys, what are certain things that people should be mindful of when they're really trying to come up with a decentralized platform, protocol, just things in general? I think, something that we spoke about backstage is that we try to use terms that we readily know and accept, but they all stem from what we know and experience from the traditional side of things. And I think a part of that is getting us into trouble a little because we're using terminology that is used on the more centralized side of things, on the traditional side of things. And if we're trying to say that decentralized, whatever, finance or something like that is different from the traditional sense, then we kind of need to not use the same terminology. But do you guys want to go into like specifics?
Yeah, and one really important point to note about decentralization is a lot of people are familiar with kind of decentralization as this magical key. Like if you're decentralized, you're immune from SEC scrutiny. But a lot of people don't stop to think about why that's the case. And it's really important to consider that the idea behind the securities laws are to protect the average investor that doesn't have access to all of the information. So the reason that decentralization is this key to immunity from regulation is that if an entity is truly decentralized, that theoretically means that everybody, every member of the community has access to the same information. Where if you look at your average TradFi institution, that's obviously not the case. I mean, even the shareholders have radically different information than the senior management. In a decentralized entity, all of the members of the community, including the individuals who are working on behalf of the organization, have the inside out of the organization. And we're talking code, of course. Like, you can go on and look at Maple's open source code, right? But, if you look at your average entity, do you really understand what's going on behind the curtain? And that line is actually quite difficult to determine and quite fuzzy. Is it a pure DAO? Is it, how does that function? How are decisions made? It's very difficult to draw that line, and frankly, the regulators haven't clearly drawn that line either.
Yeah, but what are certain things that we can do from a best practices perspective? And so if you're going out there and you are advising the companies that you're working with, what are certain things that people should be mindful of?
But before we get into definitions and things to be mindful of, we have to think about, well, what's the audience here? Because sometimes I feel, and was saying this earlier, sometimes I feel that when we talk about what the definition of DeFi is and we talk about what decentralization means, we're doing it in a way that sounds like we're defending against something, as opposed to defining something. And I think we have to think about, okay, well, why are we defining this? Because decentralization is pretty simple, right? I mean, there's aspects of decentralization in a lot of companies, right? So there could be companies like Celsius that have a little bit on both sides.
But Celsius is not DeFi.
Right, but I understand, right? But still, it depends on what our definition of DeFi is, right? So if we're, for the purposes of this panel, if we're defining it in the lens of what now is that little area that we're going to be talking about when we talk about the application of regulation, then I understand that. But if we're talking about the DeFi in general, I think that there are more players that are DeFi.
And I think this is the struggle that a lot of us have from, the legal perspective, or just trying to advise our companies in terms or foundations or whoever you are in this ecosystem, and you want to go out there with this model or to be able to do things in a certain way, and you want to be able to do it without always thinking of this regulatory overhang over you, but especially in the United States, I don't know how you separate the two, because if decentralization were as simple as a concept, we wouldn't need the Hinman speech to tell us that there's a line.
Once again, the Hinman speech is specifically regulation,
And maybe
right?
someone should just tell everybody what the Hinman speech is, FYI.
It's nonsense. The Hinman speech is nonsense, right? He said it. Nobody believed him then. Nobody believes him now. The SEC doesn't believe it. So we should all forget about the Hinman. Lee's personal opinion.
Yeah, but no one believes
That's
it,
all
but
we
yet
need.
that is the kind of best guidance we have right now.
Everybody goes
as
back to it. I know,
yeah.
but nobody believes it. So
This was a speech basically outlining what is decentralization. So giving
Well-
broadly, but questionable whether it was all that helpful. That's the speech we're referring to.
It didn't even go that far,
Yeah.
Yeah,
right?
it just-
it said
it
that something
introduced-
started off as being centralized, and then at some point there is some sort of imaginary magic line that you can kind of hop over, and that you're in sufficiently decentralized land. And I think the issue...
Are you sure it's a line and not pixie dust that you throw on it
It's
to
really
make it
pixie dust.
decentralized?
It's invisible. It's invisible marker.
But to answer your original question, like what can you point your companies or your protocols towards to move in that direction? I would say one of the tenets is transparency. Because if you can make the argument that everyone has equal access to the information, then that is decentralization. And look, what is transparency? What is radical transparency? You know, I know we strive for transparency in a lot of regards, but it's not always possible to have radical transparency. For example, our underlying legal contracts, it undermines our, ability to negotiate them. And frankly, if we put them on the internet, everyone rips them off, which creates its own issues. Open source legal doesn't necessarily exist yet, so it's not that easy. But transparency would be one kind of, tenet to strive for.
I like to think about these things and come up with analogies to other things that I know to try to figure out what they mean. So, like, I think of New York City as a decentralized place. I mean, I recognize that there's a city government, and that is not decentralized. But when you look around New York City, it's mostly this decentralized mass of people and companies and activities that are all happening at the same time. And if anybody actually tried to watch all of them at the same moment, it's impossible because there's just too much going on. And so I think of decentralization, I start with this thought of, well, there's this city or town or village of independent actors doing whatever it is that they do and amalgamating in a variety of different ways at different times for different purposes, and not controlled, not forced to do things by any centralized organization. And so then the question is, well, what kind of rule sets do you put around that? And you can put rule sets around that either from some centralized authority, like the city government, or it can be code-based. And so, to me, when we talk about decentralization for purposes of blockchains and smart contracts and DeFi and everything like that, I look at the code base, and to Catherine's point, the whole transparency thing I think is super important. And so that's sort of the way that I came to the definition of decentralization that Cathy put me on the spot about at the beginning.
I mean, I think just kind of going back to a point that we spoke about before, just in terms of terminology, right? And you think of what happens in a centralized setting, and I used customer support as an example. That's a very traditional type thing. If you have a centralized organization and you have a product that you're putting out there, you have something called customer support. But the idea of customer support is that you control it to the point where you can explain things and troubleshoot or whatever. But what if we change the concept of it, and instead of saying it's customer support, we call it education, or we call it something else? And I think it's part of the mindset of, if we're trying to not be traditional finance, if we're using DeFi in this instance, then I think we really need to not just rely on old terms or familiar terms that we use in our old boring TradFi lives and think about what we're actually trying to do and accomplish.
I think that's key, Kathy, because the other thing that we were talking about backstage is a lot of people lapse into using TradFi terminology in their day-to-day, but if there's an inquiry, frankly, the regulators will hone in on that terminology and potentially use it as part of their argument. Like, you're using securities language, you're using strike price, you're using share, you're using board. That means that you were thinking about yourself as a security. When that's actually not the case, a lot of protocols might be using that language because that's what's familiar to them. But I think you're right. I think we need to append things and find new creative language that really appropriately characterizes what we're doing and the innovation that's happening.
But if we're creative with the language, does that change the effect of what it is that we're doing? So if we're trading, but we don't call it trading, we call it swapping.
Yield.
And if we're setting strike prices and we're calling it, you know, go price, does that change what it is? I mean, do you really think that changing the language is going to defend us?
I mean, I think it's also a change in mindset, right? And I think that's why we're all here in this room.
This is all a change of mindset, right? I mean, that's really what we're talking about. The application of the regulation, but the industry itself is all about changing a mindset. And I think personally, I think it's a wonderful thing. And as we were talking about earlier, it would be wonderful if this became the trigger moment to stop us ever needing to talk about the 1934 Act again. Because it's just insane that 88 years later, we're still talking about it.
Yeah, and Katherine, you had a great fact about the 3334 Act.
So all of the securities law infrastructure is based on acts passed in 1933 and 1934. And I heard the other day that the majority of legislators that passed that act were alive during Custer's last stand.
Think about it.
So, I mean, what is a better illustration? I mean, we're not even talking about a time before the internet. Like, I don't even, my case rests in lawyer language.
Yeah, so I think that's, let's segue and kind of just talk about ways in which regulators, and I'm just throwing general, I'm not gonna just kind of pinpoint specific ones, but in what ways have regulators tried to directly or indirectly regulate DeFi recently?
The SEC is attempting, we're in the middle of passing a very, very, very long rule, I think it was 700 pages, that would bring DeFi protocols under regulation ATS. And I won't go into the specifics because it's pretty technical, but suffice it to say it would make a lot of DeFi protocols register as an ATS. That has some fundamental issues. A lot of the major groups, Blockchain Association, Global DCA, DeFi Education Fund, have issued really persuasive letters levying a number of really serious issues, including free speech concerns. I would say that's probably the number one specific attack on DeFi. That is actually a rule. The other issues that have popped up in DeFi are there's some cases that are kind of making their way through the courts, and some potential investigations and negotiations that could have an effect. Although that's another conversation because the favorite thing to talk about in the crypto community is the regulation by enforcement, which is happening now, which is, you know, very un-American and disturbing, frankly.
Okay, so
I was just going to say, you know, having been in government for 6 years, I'm a little hesitant to assume that the things like the ATS rule were directly intended to impact DeFi. There's much more of a trend of doing through incompetence rather than actual malice. And so, you know, the SEC in that regard, no one's shown to me that that's actually their motive. The SEC enforcement stuff, I think, is very clearly meant to rein in DeFi.
Well, I had a conversation with someone who's recently left the SEC, and when I brought that point up, they said, yes, indeed, it is meant to capture DeFi. Okay. So that was...
Whereas in direct contrast to the Loomis bill, for example, where, you know, I heard a conversation with a staffer where they said DeFi was not mentioned in that, you know, potential legislation specifically by design. So that was, I guess, encouraging in a way and discouraging in a way, that the legislators aren't thinking about ways to put into place laws that would address DeFi. But yeah, Chris, I'd like to think that. But I think even if they had proposed that rule, not intending to target DeFi, you know, they had the comment period where the industry was up in arms, and they didn't back off from that.
But in general, that's the way they regulate and talk about things. I mean, they don't do it. They don't say, "Hey, we're targeting this particular company." They don't have to say they're targeting DeFi. They're going to say it by, you know, rule changes that then can be applied.
Yeah, and I would also say the thing that strikes me, especially with the two most recent things that like the SEC case on the insider trading, the Tornado Cash thing from OFAC. I think it's a little hard still to see this as a unified effort. Like, I think in the crypto community, we see this as the government, but these are all separate entities. And, you know, for example, the Biden administration had this big policy proposal in EO on how to unify government policy on crypto. Well, SEC civil enforcement actions don't go through that policy process. The OFAC process goes through a much smaller group of like the national security folks in government who are weighing in on that. It's not an all of government approach, and so there's still an opportunity for some good to come out of the policy process that the Biden administration is doing as it relates to crypto and DeFi, even if there's these individual actions that may seem like, you know, direct assaults on DeFi from SEC or OFAC or whoever.
So the government's a little decentralized itself. One other point I just wanted to add, and I know it's a lot of fun to pick on the SEC, but I actually think the bigger danger for DeFi is on the anti-money laundering side, and Tornado Cash is not technically anti-money laundering, but I think indicative of some of the things that governments can do in connection with their anti-money laundering and fighting terrorism authority. And so there's been a huge amount of debate at a variety of governmental organizations and intragovernmental organizations in the US and globally on these issues. I actually think that's going to be the first port of call that the DeFi space is going to have to grapple with. And so coming up with ways to do DeFi with known participants is probably going to be an important next innovation.
Okay. So we are going to quickly just talk about Tornado Cash, just because it's, I mean, for me, I find it terrifying, and it's...
What does your T-shirt say, Kathy?
Privacy is normal. And so I think there are privacy concerns, but I think, Lee, you mentioned it backstage. If we're talking about privacy versus like AML or, anti-terrorism and all those other policy initiatives, unfortunately, privacy will always come second or third to those concerns. But when we're talking about Tornado Cash, and I think there is a huge backlash, especially when you're thinking that this is like a decentralized protocol, or this is like a smart contract where, there is really no centralized organization or function behind it. The argument at a very base level is people are saying that this is code, and that it's speech, and it's then protected under the First Amendment in this country, and so it doesn't make sense to put code on an SDN list. Someone remind me what SDN is again?
Specially designated national. So,
yes.
and just for the other people in the audience, the Department of Treasury, Office of Foreign Assets Control, levies sanctions on individuals and entities and smart contracts as a way of basically punishing them and disincentivizing Americans from dealing with these entities. So it's a really harsh penalty, because as soon as someone or something or some smart contract is sanctioned, that means an American cannot touch that with a 10-foot pole, or that American will be subject to criminal prosecution. Like, this
meaning jail.
Jail.
Well, and
this is as serious as, like I always say, in the risk infrastructure, there's regulatory risk, which we've been talking about, but there's also criminal risk. And the latter is existential for a project.
Yeah. And it's strict liability, which in legal terms means, or in normal terms means like you can't say I did my best effort to avoid this. It's just like if you did and it interacted with this person or bank account or whatever, like you can be charged and will have to pay a lot to avoid that.
So for me, I think putting a smart contract or even wallet addresses on this list is ludicrous, but we have very differing opinions, and so I think we should kind of flesh those out really quickly.
I'm going to get booed off stage for this, and I almost didn't mention this because it's a little inflammatory, but I actually think there are some interesting parallels between the gun debate and the Tornado Cash situation. I mean, when you look at firearms, they're not always just used to kill people, right? But everyone wants to crack down and regulate the hell out of them, right? And some people are saying, leave me alone with my guns. If you look at Tornado Cash, like, of course, there's a multitude of reasons why people want to use mixers for privacy, right? But there's also a whole bunch of reasons why people are using Tornado Cash. You know, the data says that the North Koreans have used Tornado Cash to basically launder in excess of $1 billion on that platform. So from the regulatory and enforcement point of view, this has effectively been co-opted by criminals, and therefore they have the reason to outweigh the privacy considerations in a paternalistic protectionism fashion. In the same way that, you know, certain legislators are saying we're going to take away the guns to protect the average American. So it's just something to consider. I think it's not so easily dismissed as like this is the end game for privacy rights.
I think the gun analogy, at least in some respect, is an interesting one, because there have been cases where actually like blueprints for guns have been put on sanctions lists before and prohibited from being distributed. And, you know, people have argued that same kind of thing, that this is free speech, like it's just, you know, a blueprint, right? Which is in some ways, you know, similar to a design for a smart contract. And those cases, as far as I know, have actually won on free speech grounds. But more broadly, I think it is somewhat concerning, and something that DeFi is going to have to reckon with, which is for the last 8-9 years, we've in the crypto community have tried to make law enforcement comfortable with crypto in general, and that it's not just a bunch of bad actors. And that argument has really resonated with law enforcement because law enforcement can see where the funds are going. They have resources and the tools to see and track what's going on the blockchain. And so to the extent that mixers and things like Tornado Cash are undercutting that, that's going to be hugely problematic for the goodwill that's already been built up with law enforcement towards crypto. And so that's something we're going to have to reckon with.
Agreed, and the sanction wouldn't have come if it weren't for the fact that the investigators were having a difficult time with it. And I think that's really what it's all about. And you know, we were talking back about that. There are 2 points. One, you were making that you can't sanction a smart contract, that's kind of new territory. And you know, we're talking about sanctioning wallet addresses associated with it. Those wallet addresses within DeFi, those are DeFi people. And so, you know, an argument could be made that they are de facto sanctioning people, but they're not able to name those individuals, so they're doing it with wallet address numbers. And I mean, I don't see too much difference there. But also, you know, that as a regulator who, you know, let's forget all the specific terms that they're regulating and things like that in the system, et cetera, but they want to protect investors. They want to protect people that are investing in whether it's a coin or some other token. They also want to protect against things like money laundering. They want to protect against things like funding terrorism and things like that. And if they find that they can't do that and that this is a venue for it, they're going to keep looking until they find a solution to it. So all of these, you know, extensions of existing terminology like ATS are just being changed so that they have a mechanism. They may fail with that mechanism. They'll try another one. They'll eventually succeed one way or the other because it's what they want to do.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just concerned about slippery slopes, and, you know, if you kind of designate one smart contract on the SDN list, what does that mean going forward? I mean, does this open the door for a bunch of smart contracts to just, is that a way?
Or bridges.
Or bridges, right? So all of a sudden, I mean, at this point, I'm not scared of Chair Gensler anymore. I'm scared of this, because all of a sudden you're going to be designated or slapped with this label, and as Chris said, it's strict liability. So once you're on that list, once you interact with it, you're dead. There's no coming back from it. Black and white. Right. So I think this might be a good segue then into, well then, does regulation for DeFi make sense? Should it be regulated? I think a lot of people will say no, but is that really a realistic way to think about it? And if there should be regulation, what should that look like?
I think the answer to that question starts with actually who should be regulated. Because if something is what we might say truly DeFi, that is to say, it's this autonomously functioning smart contract on a public permissionless blockchain that nobody can stop unless they turn off the internet, it's not clear to me who gets regulated at that point. Now, maybe the argument is we should tell the developers that they have to incorporate certain things in the smart contract when they write it before it gets deployed. I don't know if that's the right answer or not. Seems like a kind of a weird answer to give. But there are plenty of rule sets that get programmed into all kinds of code over time. So maybe that's one solution. But these are hard questions of figuring out who gets regulated. And the questions around autonomously functioning code are particularly difficult, not just from a blockchain context, but when we think about artificial intelligence and machine learning and autonomously driving vehicles and all kinds of stuff like that. And people are not thinking that in that direction at all. And so I suspect we will end up with weird distinctions that will make no sense in the greater context of the world when it comes to regulation of DeFi.
I worry a lot about that too, Lee, the kind of patchwork that's happening that isn't going to be a clear path forward and isn't going to be helpful. Although I would like to see some regulation at some point, because when I was in the private sector, I used to give this presentation to my firm's clients that were interested, Crypto 101, and both encouragingly because they wanted to sit through the presentation, but also disturbingly, sometimes it was literally to the C-suite of major financial services organizations, and it covered things like, what is a wallet? And I would always start that presentation with Econ 101, like Bitcoin has all of the characteristics of a successful currency, if you look at basic economics, except for the fact that a fully scaled asset class has a clear set of regulatory guidance and regulatory guidelines. So if we really want crypto and DeFi to be a thing and to really continue to have this kind of nascent, exciting growth and touch and reach more people, we're gonna need some degree of regulatory guidelines that make sense.
But the worst thing that could happen is for FINRA, which governs ATSs and broker-dealers, to start governing or regulating the DeFi area, because I can tell you from personal experience, they don't even understand tokenization. So it's going to be a real learning curve for them. They have maybe a couple of teams that are educated enough to deal with the few broker-dealers and ATSs that are doing tokenization, but it's a long way. And right now, even those few broker-dealers and ATSs that are doing tokenization, they're running duplicate systems in order to be able to do that, which is ridiculous on its face, especially when you consider the efficiency of blockchain. It's just, I don't know that DeFi can fit into the regulation that is already screwed up for TradFi, because it's operating by antiquated rules, and they're trying to change little language here and there in order to make up for the antiquated rules. It needs to be rewritten. The best case scenario for DeFi is a new SRO, self-reporting organization or a self-regulating organization that can really just focus on DeFi specifics because there are areas of ATS and broker-dealer regulation that would just never be able to be done.
I'm going to just slightly disagree with both of you. I don't think we can say that crypto assets is an asset class. It is definitely not a monolithic asset class. So I don't... And so having one set of rules and having one regulator for it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. The example that I like to give is the, fart jar NFTs just ain't like Bitcoin. And I don't know why you would say that you want one regulator to regulate the trading in both of those things. But now I'm going to completely contradict myself and completely agree with you guys, because we actually do have some ideas here, because what's happening in DeFi is various types of trading markets. And I include the lending stuff, the AVAs and compounds of the world in the trading markets. It's just different kinds of trading are happening. And the maples, yes.
That was generous.
It's just different kinds of trading markets. And we do have these concepts of market integrity that we apply to the securities laws. We apply them in the commodities context. So we apply them in different contexts. And because what's happening in DeFi is transactional in nature, we can maybe come up with some market integrity constructs that would be really helpful here. See Gibraltar Principle 10, which just got announced 6 months ago.
So going back to quickly, like on the concept of like an SRO, I mean, the concept has been floated around, but for an SRO, you also need a regulator to kind of oversee the SRO. So if you think of FINRA, right, that's one, and its governing regulator is the SEC. So in this case, who's the regulator overseeing an SRO?
FTC.
I think we can guess,
Commission.
but I think the government is going to decide, and then that's going to be it. I don't think it's not necessarily going to make sense to us. I think that they just need a mechanism to be able to do it, and it may not be the SEC, may not be any of the candidates we consider. It might be its own department that gets set up for that purpose. But we were talking earlier about we get so lost in the DeFi defense of what is a security, what's not a security. The definitions of DeFi, which can get quite detailed. And really, if we all could kind of sit down at the same table, both regulators, if government was sitting here, if we're sitting here, at the baseline, they have ordinary people that are investing in things, whatever they are, that are investing in things to make money, and they are, and they're currently not protected. They're not given... there are not requirements on education. We talked about education. There are not requirements on gatekeepers. In traditional finance, there are gatekeepers that their sole role is to take care of people like that, people that don't know any better. And there are a lot of people that don't know any better. And crypto is a risky area. I mean, even though we all believe in it, and it's going to go through the roof, but ultimately, from a government perspective, it's risky, and people have lost all of their money. How can I approach you and find a way to protect those people, and how can we participate in that?
And Ben, look, I think your point about entirely rethinking regulation is 100% where we should be going. And it's not because the existing regulations are all bad or anything like that. To me, it's because all of these different types of assets are trading in the same venue. And we're just not used to that, right? In the old world, stocks traded over there and bonds traded like over there, and futures traded there and swaps traded there, and different clearing entities applied depending on what all the nonsense was, right? And what's happened with blockchain and with DeFi is it collapses all of that. And in fact, to me, it's the culmination of what what's been the movement of technology in financial instruments and other trading markets for the last 50 years. And because everything can just be and trade interchangeably, we're in a new world. And because we're in a new world, maybe we should just start from first principles and rebuild everything and collapse regulators so that we have a good regulator that does all of the stuff here.
And I think that we'll get to that if you start to see some SEC failures in court and others failing to extend the current language to cover it. And I think that they're going to be fighting so hard for that. If they start losing, I think we're closer to that.
Well, and on a very positive note, I love how you frame that, Lee, because like this is why we're all here. Like the access to your average investor having that potential alpha that prior to crypto really only was in the hands of institutions or accredited investors or venture capital or private equity. And that democratization of finance is really important to keep that in mind. So whatever regulation or protections we put in place, I think we need to keep that front of mind to facilitate this growth and this innovation. And that's why we have a lot of really incredible people, lawyers, developers, entrepreneurs who have left very lucrative private sector gigs to go do this.
I want to take that even one step
Hold on,
further.
wait. Are we out of time? or?
No, we're actually just going to open the floor to questions.
Okay.
Can I just take Catherine's point one step further? Because I agree that there's lots of people who are quote-unquote investing here, but there's actually lots of people who are buying and selling stuff because they need to use it on blockchains or in smart contracts and things like that. And you know, I'm not sure fart jars are bought as investments. Maybe somebody's buying them as investments. But
What about crypto dick butts?
you know, well, right? Is that
Judgment-free zone.
Are you buying it for investment purposes or are you buying it for humor purposes? I would probably buy fart jars for the humor value, not for the investment value. But you know, I'm still 5 years old.
All right. Well, let me just say, you know, we have some experts that have worked between DeFi and regulation, you know, on the front line. So if any of you here in the audience have a question you'd like to ask of the panel, just put up your hand. If you, and yeah, get ready to talk.
I think there was a question.
B has a question. They know who you are, B.
Hi, I was just wondering, how do you deal with like the saying that everything is securities fraud?
Well, everything related to securities that is fraudulent is securities fraud. But if it's not a security, then there's no securities fraud. So this is do you agree with me? Fart jars are not securities? Okay, so then there's no securities fraud if I defraud you when I sell you my fart jar. I love saying things like that. I can't wait to testify in front of Congress and say things like that. I can't wait to get Gary Gensler to say that fart jars are securities.
Just make sure that a question uses that term so he has to say it, and then we can turn it into a meme. No, but like your question...
I seriously have tried to get that in there.
You have fraud, and then you have operating with unregistered securities, and I think some legitimate opposition to the SEC's approach to date has been that the SEC is treating the two things as the same. Like, I think everyone agrees that the regulator should crack down on illegal conduct or protocols that are defrauding people. Nobody wants that happening in this space. It takes away legitimacy and credibility from all of us. Yep. I think the real question is whether the SEC should be spending their very limited resources in pursuing, you know, things they theoretically see as securities that are doing good things and being responsible and transparent, but they're, you know, wrapped up in the SEC's questionable purview because they may or may not be a security.
And I'll take that one step further. The SEC does not have jurisdiction over things that are not securities. And so they don't get to go and blame people for fraud for things that are not securities. If it's commodities, then the CFTC has jurisdiction. The FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, has jurisdiction under general consumer protection rules. States have jurisdiction over, there's lots of people who have jurisdiction. The SEC is not the super regulator that gets to decide everything that happens in the world yet.
Hi, I'm Sahib Aziz. I'm with Contracts.finance. We're an upcoming DAO that's going to try to make DeFi easy on Arbitrum and Mainnet. So my question is, as a founder of an upcoming project, it won't even start as a DAO. Like, it has to, by design, sort of start centralized, get it in our hands, then release as a DAO. How worried should I, my co-founder, be here in America, US citizens, starting this project, and some regulation comes which makes our DAO, or before even DAO, our company, like illegal overnight, maybe even criminal, right? Like, we're literally on the cusp of launch, and like, these are things on my mind. So, like, what could you say to someone like me? We have a lawyer, we're taking all the regulatory steps, but we can't prepare for what hasn't happened. So, like, how worried should we be about what hasn't happened yet?
When we were talking about this backstage, Cathy and I share a philosophy on this. Look, like,
But this is not legal advice.
no, this is none of this. None of what we have said is legal advice or investment advice, and we speak in our and I speak in my individual capacity and not behalf of my organization. So we probably all should have said that before we.
And I'm unfettered by
Yeah.
legal knowledge.
He's not a lawyer, so yeah. I mean, no, but I think that the key is, do you have justification and do you have proactive arguments that make sense? There's a lack of clarity, so it's very unlikely that tomorrow or in 6 months or in a year there's going to be a law or even precedent that directly affects your company. But if it touches your company, or if the government could make an argument that you're out of bounds, do you have a leg to stand on? Like, can you get comfortable with the risk? And that's what lawyers, especially in-house counsel, can do. Private sector lawyers, obviously, their mandate is a little different. Their main usefulness is to kind of, present the red flags and then leave the decision-making up to you. You have to make sure that you are justified, especially given the lack of clarity in the law, frankly, or in precedent. Do you have good arguments, common sense arguments, arguments where you have a basis in case law to advance your interpretation of the legality of your project? That's all that we can do. And frankly, in my opinion, it's enough in a lot of the cases. When there's not a law and there's not a case saying you can't do X, then it is open for debate whether you can do X.
And it's only applicable for a slice of time, right? It's not applicable. Like, if you're looking for the magic pill that's going to make you safe for what you're building, there isn't one. You're not safe. But I mean, it's because things can change in the future. You just have to adapt.
Maybe just to put it slightly differently, it's highly unlikely that what you're doing will become illegal outright. Right. What's probably going to happen is there will be some regulation that will be annoying, and you will be forced to do some new stuff. And unless you're starting out trying to do something illegal, which I would strongly discourage you from doing. But so really, it's more like, how much annoyance are you going to have to put up with in the future? And that's very unclear right now, as you can tell from what we've been talking about for the last hour. But that's sort of the way you should be thinking about it.
Hey there. If we have the base assumption that the Tornado Cash being put on the SDN was to prevent North Korea, Lazarus Group in particularly, of getting their hands on effectively $1 billion, and as a result of that, there was a whole lot of collateral damage, being a whole bunch of random people's security. With that underlying assumption, that was the premise for putting Tornado Cash on the SDN, can the panel suggest other ways that the Lazarus Group or North Korea or other bad actors using Tornado Cash or other protocols could have been specifically targeted without the collateral damage that has resulted as a result of putting Tornado Cash on the SDN?
That's a really good question, and query whether, and Tornado is decentralized, right? So I get the sense that OFAC made some sort of effort. In their statement, they alluded to this fact of trying to get Tornado Cash to put some sort of, compliance infrastructure in place to avoid what was happening or mitigate, the use of its code from the North Korean perspective. I don't know how they would do that with a decentralized organization. Like, who did they talk to? Who did they go to at Tornado Cash and say, do X? Because, like, having represented a number of TradFi entities in OFAC and DOJ investigations linked to criminal sanctions, there's usually a long lead up to an actual sanction. There's an investigation, there's conversations, there's advocacy, there's proposed modifications. And then at the end, if something isn't satisfied, that's when they slap you with a sanction and fine you, et cetera. So to answer your question specifically, I think that OFAC probably had conversations and suggested that they put certain protective measures in place, but we just can't opine on whether those suggested measures were reasonable or whether that would even make Tornado Cash live to see another day.
I feel like that's a whole other conversation.
These are difficult questions when it comes to autonomously functioning code, right? So we don't even know if the Tornado Cash guys could reprogram Tornado Cash and stop the existing Tornado Cash smart contract from functioning. They say that they can't, and I have no reason to disbelieve that. Assuming that that's true, it's hard to see, when you have autonomously functioning code, what other steps can be taken.
Right.
Now, maybe the NSA should be shutting down North Korea's internet, and there's bigger things that can be done like that. But short of stopping the internet, some of these things are really tough to figure out how to do it another way.
Yeah. I think when you hear conversations on the ways to potentially regulate DeFi, it's not necessarily regulating smart contracts, but it's the on-ramps or other ways that you can access those platforms or those smart contracts. But that doesn't necessarily get to the heart of it too, because when you include on-ramps, or if you have oracles, or you have any other thing that kind of plugs into it, you're still bringing in maybe a centralized actor or something else, and it kind of defeats the purpose in a way of DeFi. So I think we were all saying that I think we need to get a little creative in terms of how legislation, how regulation kind of pans out from all of this. But in terms of starting from scratch, that's more of a pipe dream at this point. So.
Hi, I'm B. I'm terrified. This is a really scary conversation. This is a room of super powerful people with a lot of smarts and ability and talent. Education has been brought up as something we can do to affect the outcome of this. I personally have been invited to talk to, why don't you go talk to the CFTC? Why don't you go talk to the SEC? I don't want to do that because that sounds like I'm opening myself up. Am I wrong? What can we do to affect the outcome of all of this?
Go work at the CFTC? I think that is
Run for office?
I think that is a problem, though. So, if you look at the people that are in all of these organizations, not a single one of them is allowed to own crypto. I think I recall when Biden made his first appointments, one person that he brought into his administration had crypto reported on his compliance sheet, and he was recused from doing anything in the crypto space. So there's literally people there's no one in government that is actually allowed to own or operate in this space and do their job. And so, there's ways to fix that on the ethics rules and whatnot. But the easier way is have people that have been in the space already go in and really take one for the team and educate from the inside, I think.
Do I have liability, though? Am I going to put myself up for, arrest me if I go into that?
You won't get arrested. I will say, I was recently on a panel with some senior SEC prosecutors, and one of the things they said is, come in, engage with CorpFin, which is the division of kind of innovation in the SEC, talk to us. And I think the difficulty there is even in the private sector, some counsel will not advise DeFi projects to engage with the SEC because you run the risk of putting yourself on their radar. Now, that's not the way that it should be. That's actually devastating because I would love to have an open line of communication with all the regulators for educational purposes. Like, consider this, see it my way, I want to change your mind. Unfortunately, it's just not the current state of play. That's not true of all regulators. Like, a lot of projects and a lot of lawyers in the space and a lot of advocates in the space and, blockchain associations doing great work are having day-to-day conversations with legislators and regulators, both domestic and foreign. I would love to see that continue because education, that knowledge gap is just massive right now. And until we overcome that and get everyone comfortable with the basics and understand, like Lee's been talking about the distinctions here, which is huge. Like, DeFi is a different animal than NFTs, so you can't put them all in the same bucket and do the same thing, and CBDCs and smart contracts and stable coins. And unfortunately, we're just not there to the point where everyone understands that. So, I mean, you as an individual, you're not going to get prosecuted, but you do run the theoretical risk of putting your project a little bit higher on the subpoena list. And I wish that wasn't the case, but I can't tell you whether it is or is not.
But one thing I would say is, even though we love to demonize the SEC, I mean, they are approachable, and so even if you are talking to them about a serious matter, they handle it very approachably. It's not what you might expect. So I know this from my previous life, but yeah, I mean, but I agree. It does have it. You do run the risk of putting yourself on their radar. But if you happen to, by luck, be on their radar anyway, talking to them is probably a good thing.